Hey everybody, welcome back to the Sven Quest. Today, I just finished a book. This is a book I purchased roughly, 2 days after he dropped a video that it had been put out on Kindle. Or not Kindle, but the Amazon self-publishing. Sam O'Nella's, or Sam A. Miller's, Still Lost. This is an anthology of short stories. And I just finished it last night. Stayed up probably around midnight reading it. I was at the last story and I just didn't want to stop in the middle. It was pretty gripping. I just want to give a few brief thoughts on this book. What I liked, what I didn't, some thoughts on each story. So it kind of begins with the funny little intro, but getting into the meat of it, we have the prologue, Fiat Strepitus. This was the introduction to the story, and it introduces these guys on the cover, the Xenos, or the Sillies. Ooh, I'm going to have to bleep that. I don't know if we can say that on YouTube. Basically, the whole introduction is they show up to Earth, and we start attacking them. Before they reveal, okay, look, we were coming down here to see if you could join our super cool space group. You're not. You're attacking people. You're a protected species. And so what they do is they fix all the problems in the Earth. And that's kind of that's the introduction for the story. That's the catalyst. That kind of sets up this world. I really liked this chapter. I thought it was pretty fun. Most of it follows them trying to attack the Xenos and the unsuccessfulness of it. The whole thing is the Xenos retaliate on the humans whenever they get attacked. It's like the humans can really damage them, but like they shoot missiles at them while they blow up the guy that sent the missile. And it's funny. It's got a classic blend of, if you've ever seen a Sam O'Nella YouTube video, which if you're watching this, you probably have, it perfectly blends the comedy with also the storytelling and, communicating in a real sense what happened. And, in this case, it's a narrative, it's a story that he's communicating, but it really does a fantastic job of introducing the world, giving a fun little story, and just the humor that's woven throughout. I thought it was a really strong start to the book. And that chapter sort of leads into chapter 2, Xenos, And it has this funny plot framing. A biologist kind of goes into this brothel, and they meet with a Xeno and kind of are trying to learn more about them. And I thought this part was pretty interesting. It's one of the big themes of the book. We get the Xenos, but he plays it very close to his chest, giving us much more detail outside of what they look like, And that's kind of the whole theme throughout the book is the introduction prologue really sets up the Xenos. And beyond the first chapter, they're present, but they don't do much. They're not really, the effects are felt throughout the narrative. But the Xenos, they're not really there as much as they are in the prologue in this first chapter. Other than that, these are just, general sci-fi concept short stories. And I think that might be one of the very few things I don't like about this book is that I kind of wish for all the introduction setup we get in the prologue, wish we could have saw a little more of the Xenos. I think maybe getting a first-person perspective chapter from a Xenos or something like that would have really tied together their inclusion in this book. Because overall, I feel like, honestly, it does, there's so much setup for this cool concept, and I feel like I would have liked to seen more of it, honestly. And that's not even a criticism of the book. It's just, it is a criticism of the book. What am I saying? But it's not a criticism of the other stories. I think they should have just been included a little more with how much setup he does to include them in the book. But anyway, long story short, she gets a sample of the blood of the Xeno, and, you know, she runs into this crazy lady from a church. The church's name, Visitationist. Visitationist, their church, they worship the Xenos. And he says it in his end notes, you know, where he gives his inspiration for stories, but it's kind of like white guy takes on, or like white atheist takes on religion and no one cares. Kind of joke, you know. She runs into the lady, they like, you know, there's a whole squabble with the blood sample. She goes to a church thing. A lot of people get hurt in a gas explosion because it, you know, the compounds within the blood cause a vapor. It burns people because it wasn't, you know, handled properly. Honestly, you know, and obviously I'm religious. I feel like in a lot of ways, like, I don't know, I didn't feel like the story was about religion bad. And I don't know if if I can disagree with the author, but I don't think it was about religion good either. I just sort of, I felt like it was a very agnostic, kind of middle of the road kind of approach to it, you know, where the main character did something bad, people in the church did something bad. It's kind of just a wash, you know, all the way around. I thought this one was pretty interesting. You know, it was interesting to kind of get some like little snippets on more of, okay, like, you know, they're here, but we don't understand their biology. You know, it makes sense for there to be like a religious group that worships them. I think he puts in a whole psalm that's supposed to be like very contemplative. And he says he spent as much time or more on that psalm, which is like one page, than like the rest of the chapter. And I think the psalm is really well written. I think it's good. It does everything it should, which is being like contemplative without being, you don't have to put too much thought into it. The only thing I would say is it has no bearing on the story other than showing they just worship anything the Xenos say, you know, which is kind of funny. I do think it's funny, you know. Okay, well, there's, you know, like, the whole joke is the deeper thought isn't there. It's just made up, you know. That's a little more commentary on religion. I thought this chapter was neat. Hopefully we can edit this into something usable. Second chapter, being a nothingness. This, if it isn't the best chapter in the book, it is a heavy hitter. I think it really sums up a lot of stuff. And if you watched my last video, you would know I've been thinking about this a lot. It sums up a lot of ideas of discontentment with just scrolling mindlessly, and, you know, a character who's like, I'm so mentally deranged, I need help, and it's like, you just needed to clean your room, dude. Like, watch 2 Jordan Peterson videos and just lock in, you know, that kind of stuff. And I think this one's interesting because, you know, you kind of like, oh man, this guy's nuts. And it's like, no, he's just chronically online and he needs to like go outside and touch grass. And I feel like that's kind of underselling it, you know, and there is a lot of like philosophical references in this chapter to various philosophers. And he talks more about that in the after section, but I thought that the overall narrative of this was gripping. The framing was funny. Again, the comedy woven throughout, you know, and like kind of this, oh, we can put your brain in a simulation and you can like deal with your unconscious. Like, you know, it's a funny framing. He does good comedy with it. And it's, you know, it ends with a good conclusion and a good message, I think, which is put your phone away and go outside. Like this one a lot. Next one was Eggs for Roman. This one's kind of like I won't say it's just Planet of the Apes. You know, you got this little ape, Habibi. And anyway, they're giving him this whole compound. It's, you know, making him progressively smarter, you know, just Planet of the Apes style. It talks about like kind of Planet of the Ape concepts and how would that work, you know, in reality. It also kind of like, you know, whips at, you know, like, you know, modern stuff, animal cruelty, you know, influencers, just online stuff like that. And I thought this one was fun. It had a really good framing device, where we kind of get like random sparse thoughts from him as a monkey that slowly get more developed over time, and more, I'd say more better worded, or I'm going to sound like the monkey, but the wording improves, and it's this really neat narrative device that he does, and it's just a fun little story. It's got some good little gimmicks sprinkled through. I liked this one. I think this one's up there. If you had to read a story in this, I think that one is a really fun little grab bag one. That or Being a Nothingness. I think those would be probably my favorite stories in this. 4 little words. This is by far the shortest chapter. I mean, about a third of the length is all the other ones. And the whole joke is the 4 little words. Grass does feel pain. And this one's really funny because it's just a whole bunch of people who now have an ethical, they think they have an ethical problem, and they kind of start freaking out. And they're like, we got to take this to our grave. Like mowing a grave of grass is like getting stung with a bee for like 90 years. And like, it's pretty funny, and they just kind of like start freaking out because of all of the pain ever inflicted on plants and animals and everything. This is a very just silly chapter. It doesn't get quite as high concept as all the other ones, with like terms of sci-fi concepts or philosophy. I found it a very good sort of reprieve from some of the more serious themes. I think this one's a good little kind of palate cleanser. I wonder if maybe it should have been put toward, I don't know, in the middle is perfect, because I feel like it would distract you from like kind of the more serious top and the more serious bottom. It's this really good kind of break in the middle, little snack story. And I mean, as he points out, it is silly that academia would actually act on any result of a study and with any sort of haste. It's funny. It's good. It's worth your time. It's a very short read. Honestly, if you're going to read one of them, I know I just said if you're going to read any of them, read the other 2. But this one is a good little introduction to how the rest of the story will kind of be written if you go through and read this collection of novels. I think it's pretty good. Next story, Bloodstreams. It's about assassination live streamer kind of guys. The whole thing follows Damocles. He goes around, he kills, an HOA lady who's being mean. He goes and tries to kill a math teacher, and then it turns out to be a trap by another one of these vigilante streamer guys. And there's some comedy and explanations of sci-fi themes kind of interspersed in there. I liked this one, but I felt like we haven't gotten to the story yet, but the next story, The Prophet, Sam says he thinks that this is the weakest story. I don't know. I feel like, to me, Bloodstreams is the weakest story. I could not really get invested in the character. I thought it was interesting, but everything else has had a little, a twist, a spin put on it. And I felt like, to me, this one, it didn't have that same sort of punch I was looking for. It was just streamer killer guy does streamer killings, then fights another streamer killer guy. And I think a good twist at the end would definitely move up where it's punching in its weight class. But where it stands, I do unfortunately think that, to me, this is the weakest story in the bunch for what it is. There's still more story out here, obviously, than, 4 little words. But in its sort of spot, that's a little short story. There's obviously not going to be as much development. But for a full 30-page story like the rest of them, I think this is the weakest one, unfortunately. But would I still say read it? Absolutely. I think if you're going to read this book, you should just read the whole thing straight through. I think if you have ever watched a Salmonella YouTube video, I think there's probably almost 100% chance you will really enjoy this book. like I have. Next story, The Prophet. This one's interesting. It's all about Delphi consulting. Insert joke about Oracle of Delphi. This guy hooks himself up to what he calls the flow. It's just a bunch of data collection stuff. He gives people these artisanal prophecies, and the whole character's trying to figure out what it means. He's just trying to figure out, what does this mean? What does this prophecy I've been given means? He's skeptical. Ends up kind of going into we would think a subversion of it, not the typical, kind of grand scale of things, And then where I think it gets interesting is towards the end. And Sam says in the outro he thinks he used too much technobabble in this part. I think I have a high tolerance for technobabble in my sci-fi. As long as you can sit there and tell me how you thought this would work logically and we're having fun, I think we can have fun. And I think I had fun with this chapter, towards the end when he kind of starts unraveling this, he goes, okay, the prophecy made my dog die. Why didn't he actually warn me? And then they realize, he gets into their servers, finds out the whole thing's orchestrated, finds out they've been using these little mosquito robots to essentially get all the data and monitor everything. They're not actually monitoring the web. He's just orchestrating and deliberately planning these events to try to gain control over people. I was like, oh, it's a really neat idea. Okay, we've made prophecies by inventing them ourselves, kind of a classic criticism of prophecies, oh, they just made it up. Oh, they orchestrated themselves. But this one I think is really interesting because it's it is a group plotting and scheming to do this. And the ending is really fun. I'm not going to spoil the ending. But it's good. This whole story, I think, is pretty good. I really like this one. The last one is called Beat. This one is the longest story in the book. It's 40 pages, 10 pages longer than the others, for the most part. And man, I kind of went into this story and I wasn't sure what to think, kind of as a capstone to the book. Obviously up until this point we've gotten, a lot of different kind of, not disparate, but a lot of these very self-contained stories, with often their only connection to the rest of the book being these one or two sentence in the whole thing, kind of connecting the threads. I think the reason it is the capstone of this book is it was very personal to the author, as he details in the end, he was struggling with addiction. And this whole thing kind of focuses on these guys getting addicted to, music drugs, for a lack of a better term. And I thought this was interesting because I personally haven't had any experience with, struggling with, a substance addiction like this. I might not be the right person to give a definitive perspective on this, but I thought it was interesting to kind of watch this character try and just fail to get out of it, to just not care, to blow it off, even though he had all these people trying to help him and get him out of this. And I feel like the narrative really sucked me in. Like I said, I was reading this late at night. I could not put it down. I was enthralled. It was kind of watching through this character, and it goes through, and it just increases. The little bit isn't enough. He's doing these new things, getting custom songs, modifying hardware, or well, not until the end, but doing all these things, and he watches addiction take his friend, which is a very real thing. People overdose all the time, and this is kind of their equivalent of overdosing on the music drugs. And yeah, and I thought the ending was really just, honestly, I'm curious if the events happened to the author. It had me thinking, this guy is in a spot, and in some ways I feel like this location is described by someone who was there and did this. And I feel like that's the thing. This chapter gripped me in a way that the other chapters didn't. Even if I didn't like some of the contents as much, or the themes, there was something about the way it was written that felt just real. Like the author had changed the coat of paint, but everything else was still like very raw. As it kind of described, okay, he's going off to this like, remote area. Headlights are going across the water there as he kind of looks out, sitting on the hood of his car, and he does these things to his headset, that he's listening to music on. It's like this brain piece, and he's trying to fry his brain just like his friend did. He took off the resistors, blew out his brain with extra power, and as he's kind of listening there, it's not really doing anything. He just sees these frogs, dancing and hopping and kind of going across the ground, and he comes to this realization, just throws away the headsets, calls his mom for help, and it's just kind of, he's in a very broken state. And I feel like this really hit me because I feel like all the other stories kind of have not a good ending, but they end in like a resolved state, The being and nothingness, the story's resolved. He's improved his life, or he's working to do it. Aches Roman, he escaped the zoo. 4 Little Words, they decide to hide the evidence, kill the lady, Bloodstreams, the fight's resolved. I won't spoil the prophet, but the story is resolved. And in this one, there's something that was gripping to me personally about the ending, where we don't get a full resolution, and you're just sort of left with this feeling of wondering, even though he gave it up now, was there anything different about giving it up this time? Is he going to fall into it again? And I sort of wonder if that was very much the intention of the author, who kind of jokes at the end, like, if I relapse, it was just because I was lazy. And I don't know. This chapter is just very real. I think that's kind of the thing I appreciate about this whole book is, on a technical level, it's well written, and it's not, I don't know if it's standing among the giants, but it is one of the most real and human things I've read in a while. It does its own thing, unashamedly, unabashedly, and you have a fun time the whole way through. Man, I think everybody, well, I don't think everybody should read it, but if you haven't read this book yet, and you are a fan of salmonella, or a fan of just kind of, honestly, if I had to pick one genre out of this whole thing, I could pull humor. It's definitely more of an element than the sci-fi in some ways. If you just want a fun, humorous book with sci-fi elements that kind of just tie together the humor, but also the realism and the kind of, gripping tragedy in a lot of these stories, I think you will have a very good time. And if not, as my daughter calls him, the Daddy Longlegs, you will have a cool Daddy Longlegs book, just like me. All right, everybody. Well, I hope you enjoyed this little book chat we had today. If you guys do pick up a copy, let me know what you guys thought in the comments. I'm not shooing for comments. I won't beg for subscribers. Please, though. Please. But not really. But if you guys do pick up this book, I would love to chat with somebody who's read it. I have a lot, maybe thoughts that can't be expressed fully in this video. Thoughts that would come out through a discussion with someone else as I kind of dig deeper and process through it in dialogue and not just talking to myself. But man, what a good book. And I hope you all have a great day. Hope you remember, God made you very special and he loves you very much. I'll see you next time on the Spent Quest.